Hi guys, I'm Faida and welcome to Freedom is Mine. Today we're going to be talking about the African diaspora in Colombia.
Freedom is
Hey guys, how's it going? Join me now for part 3 of our video series on the African diaspora in Colombia. In part 1, we explored Afro-Colombian history and culture, and in part 2, we looked at two distinct Afro-Colombian groups, the Palenqueros and the Raizales. In this final video, we'll be looking at the Afro-Colombian community through a social and political lens, and examining how they've been disproportionately affected by the conflict in Colombia. In case you missed part 1 and 2, you'll definitely want to check those out first, so click on the link above and I'll see you back here in a few minutes. To give you some background information on the situation in Colombia, there's been an ongoing conflict since the 1960s between multiple armed groups, including the Colombian government, right-wing paramilitary groups such as the AUC, organised crime syndicates collectively known as the BACRIM, and left-wing guerrilla groups such as the FARC and the ELN. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, mostly civilians, and over 6 million people have been displaced. Colombia has the second highest number of internally displaced people in the world, second only to Syria, and higher than Iraq, the DRC and Sudan. Despite the peace deal that was signed in 2016, the fighting has since resumed. Afro-Colombians have been disproportionately affected by the conflict and account for 17% of internally displaced persons in the country. Part of the reason is that Afro-Colombian communities and territories are largely concentrated in regions of the country that are rich in natural resources, prime for the cultivation and trafficking of narcotics, predominantly cocaine. Control of these regions is highly sought after by various armed groups. That's why Afro-Colombians often get caught in the crossfire. A landmark moment for the Afro-Colombian civil rights movement was Ley 70, Law 70, passed in 1993, which stipulated that the Colombian government was bound by law to protect the ancestral homelands of Afro-descendant Colombians and defend their civil rights. Although in theory this was a huge turning point for Afro-Colombians, in practice their ancestral lands are still the most contested and vulnerable to violence. A key example of this is the 2002 Bojayá massacre. The region with the highest Afro-Colombian population is Chocó, of which the capital is Quibdó. Chocó is one of the poorest, most neglected regions in Colombia and is one of the worst affected by the violence. It was here that one of the most gruesome massacres in the history of Colombia's conflict took place in 2002.
in the small Afro-Colombian fishing village of Bojayá,
where a siege between the FARC and the AUC wiped out 10% of the village. When fighting between the two groups broke out, 500 terrified residents took shelter in the local church. FARC combatants launched a gas cylinder which fell through the roof of the church, killing at least 74 people, though some sources say as many as 119 were killed, including 45 children. Afro-Colombian community leaders who advocate for the rights of Afro-Colombians to their land titles are also targeted, threatened and murdered by illicit armed forces protecting their capital interests. There have been hundreds of murders in recent years. Activist Emilsen Manyoma and her partner Javier Rodallega were abducted, shot and stabbed in 2017. Bernardo Cuero Bravo, who worked for the National Association of Displaced Afro-Colombians, was shot in front of his home. Last year, the environmental activist and Goldman Prize winner Francia Marquez survived an attack by unknown gunmen at a meeting of Afro-Colombian human rights defenders. Community leaders and activists argue that they are sitting ducks, unprotected by the Colombian government, and they even allege that in some cases the government is complicit in the murders. Since the beginning of 2016, over 500 Colombian social leaders, activists, journalists, and land defenders have been killed. Although Afro-Colombians constitute over a quarter of the country's population, they represent over 3/4 of the country's poor. This is due to a number of factors, including historical disenfranchisement, being continually overlooked by the government, a lack of political and institutional representation, and of course, the armed conflict in Colombia. All of this has a trickle-down effect which results in widespread poor access to education and basic healthcare, limited professional opportunities, low wages, and substandard living conditions. One of the complex ramifications is that many young Afro-Colombians living in the communities worst affected by the conflict have few options to break the cycle of poverty. As a consequence, they then participate in the fighting, the arms dealing and the drug trafficking that dominates their territories. Even I have close Afro-Colombian friends whose fathers, uncles, brothers and cousins have been killed as a result of drug trafficking on the Pacific coast. And it doesn't stop there.
San Andres, Santa Catalina and Providencia, the Colombian archipelago islands, are highly strategic stopover points for organised crime syndicates and pivotal to the trafficking of cocaine, marijuana and weapons into and out of Colombia. These crime syndicates favour the raizales, Afro-Colombians native to the islands, to participate in the trafficking due to their specialised knowledge of the local waters. In spite of the obstacles that Afro-Colombians face, or perhaps in fact because of them, in the last 30 years there's been a resurgence of black political consciousness in Colombia and a proud reassertion of black rights and heritage. Several Afro-Colombian men and women have been elected to the Senate, including the Senator Piedad Córdoba. Paula Marcena Moreno Zapata was the first black female minister to be appointed to the Colombian government. Outside of politics, black consciousness can be seen to be reflected in hundreds of grassroots organizations, businesses and brands. There is even a yearly festival called Negro Fest in Medellin, where Afro-Colombians from across the country gather to celebrate and revel in their African heritage.
That brings us to the end of our 3-part series on the African diaspora in Colombia. I hope you've learned something and I will see you in the next video.
Freedom.